Thanks, Arne. Thanks for inviting me to this very interesting summer Institute session. Thanks for organizing the whole series. I think it's a great idea and very important to keep up the discussion on these topics in the Arctic that are really demanding and important. So I today wanted to talk a bit about the context of alternative energy and sustainable development, since they are linked so closely together. I wanted to start with with an overview of some of the major challenges. I might forget some here, so forgive me for that, but these are some of the major challenges in the Arctic, especially those that are related to energy issues. It's my talk is a bit focused on Canada because most of my work is in the Canadian context and the different Arctic regions that we have here. So as an overview, what I wanted to talk a bit about, and then talk about some of the policy insights, especially also related to a recent report that we've done with a number of my colleagues and students on alternative energy in the Arctic. That is also available online for anyone who's interested in reading this 200-page report. I wanted to just structure it in these 6 topics first that are challenges that motivated my talk. And those are the extraordinarily high energy costs in the Arctic region, the housing conditions that we face that are very challenging and dismal in many of the remote communities, the reliability and availability of various energy sources, which is very different than in southern areas that are grid connected and grid interconnected often. And food security, a major issue. There was a report recently issued that showed that, for example, in our latest territory that was formed, Nunavut, more than 70% of all households are food insecure, which was very shocking that it was such an extreme number of households that face these issues. We also have, of course, economic diversification and volatility as a major challenge, because many areas depend on 1 or 2 economic sectors and therefore run the risk of a downturn, and without balancing it with diversification of other economic areas. And finally, an area that I also work quite a bit in is the balancing of traditional practices and economic development. In many areas, in many areas of the Canadian Arctic, at least, we have a so-called dual economy that
Hi, Stephan. Can you hear us again? Hello? I think we might have a little bit of a technical hiccup. All right. Stephan, if you can hear us, then give us a sign. I think will need to reconnect. So I beg your pardon. That can sometimes happen if you organize webinars crossing borders and oceans. So we'll be right back with you in a little while. Just so, Piper, if you could come on stage just briefly. I think that would be great time to ask a little question in advance of your presentation later on. If we could already bridge that time for the time being, I think it might be a great opportunity to involve our students and professionals. So dear fellows, because Piper will be focusing more on the implementation angle later, she already asked us to ask you a question. So feel free to get your mouses ready to participate in our little poll. And Piper, if you want to phrase your question just as setup for your presentation later.
For sure. Well, it would be helpful for me to understand what the familiarity our participants have is with microgrids, with the term microgrid. I'll be talking extensively about that and would love to know how familiar you are, what is a microgrid, all the way to someone perhaps indicating that you're building a microgrid. I don't know, Arne, if there's if we can all see then the poll shortly, but on a scale of 1 to 5, your varying familiarity with that term, and in various contexts. And perhaps if there's the opportunity in the chat window, people could drop in additional comments or add some color and detail to what you may already know or want to learn more about with the microgrid concept.
All right, so I just shared my screen. I hope you can see it now. So please participate, go ahead, and give us a little overview. That's great because I can see the results basically in real time. I'll share them in a second when everybody had the chance to vote. The 75% of the people have already voted. Good turnout so far. Go for it, the last ones. Wonderful. So I think just one missing. So I give another 10 seconds here. But that's nice. Very well. Thank you so much. And here's the results. So Papa, I think you can build up on some overview already. I think a good 40% having a fairly familiar overview. And but still a third heard it maybe just once, and roughly 27% now would be, I think, delighted to learn a little bit more about it. So I think it's fair to say it might be good to start with a little overview of what microgrids entail, and but I think it would be also interesting for our more experienced crowd with microgrids to then follow up with a discussion that can also go a little deeper as well. Great. So Stephan is still offline. Piper, I think we might just start with your presentation then, if you're happy to do that. We'll reach out to Stephan and see where the problem is and get in touch with him as quickly as possible. Sure. And then we'll just shift around the speakers. So apologies for that again. It can happen sometimes. And right, so we'll start with you, Piper, if you're ready. Catherine, could you start Piper's presentation maybe? Thank you so much. And I'll get in touch with Dr. Schott in the meanwhile and get him on board again.
Well, it was in fact helpful to get at least the overview on what Dr. Schott's slides will be covering so that I can hit on some of the details again to help connect the red thread throughout both of these presentations. My work is focused in Alaska, and Dr. Schott is in Canada, as was just indicated. It's remarkable how, and this is probably not a headline for most of you, but it's remarkable how similar issues are, especially when it comes to human questions in our Arctic communities. So though I won't dwell on food security, certainly throughout my comments I think you'll see reference to high energy costs, poor housing quality, reliability of energy supply, economic diversification, balancing traditional practices. It's remarkable to me just that those were his high point issues too, and certainly things that we'll be talking about. So we can go to the next slide. That's a nice picture of some July fireweed here in Anchorage, where I'm based. Maybe I'll just say a few words so you know who I am. I'm the Deputy Director at the Renewable Energy Alaska Project. We're a nonprofit based in Anchorage that has 70 members. It was founded about 12 years ago by Chris Rose, who is still at the helm. And our work really is to create a common table where these diverse stakeholders can gather to discuss and compel more progressive policy in Alaska on clean energy. We define clean energy as both energy efficiency, the first fuel, and renewables with it. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Oh, am I to advance the slides? Let's see. I'm not sure I actually can. I can click through my own presentation. I'm not sure I know how to do that, however.
That's fine. We can do that for you, so no worries.
Is there a button that's obvious? I'm sorry. I missed that part of the tutorial. So Arne, are you able to advance to the next slide?
Yes, we're working on it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Oops, the presentation just disappeared, unfortunately.
I think Catherine is pulling up right now. There we go.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so just a few background facts about REAP. We have been the primary advocate for the most effective clean energy policy in the state, the Renewable Energy Grant Fund. It has appropriated $260 million worth of grant funding for renewable energy development, plus another about 600 million in energy efficiency funds for homes across the state. That's how we get to that 850 million number that you see in the right. It's replacing, our work has enabled offset of 20 million gallons of diesel fuel annually ongoing in Alaska's villages. And we also do a lot in terms of education. Last year reaching, that number is actually low, not only 2,300 students, but more like 4,000 across Alaska. Okay, next. And I'm sorry, if it's better, I'm happy to take some instruction on how to advance the slides. I just don't see an obvious button on how I would do that.
Right, I think it's fine. It's just the internet connection that takes a little while to update the slides.
Okay.
So I think Catherine is on it.
Great. You know, we've been calling it the billion-dollar bonfire, and you can see this reference in the middle. It's estimated that over the next 10 years, Alaska will spend $50 billion on energy. However, the majority of that we're sending elsewhere. It's not wealth the state is retaining because we're importing the majority of our fuel, which sounds funny in a state that whose revenues historically have 90% come from the fossil fuel sector. REAP authored with the Alaska Energy Authority the Renewable Energy Atlas of Alaska, which is downloadable at the link there. And in fact, an updated version has just been released in 2016. I should have updated my slide. It just came out a bit late in 2016. And if we go to the next slide, then it will indicate some of the findings in this annual or every few years study. Alaska's energy infrastructure, if you're not familiar, and I'm just giving this by way of background before we get into the microgrid question, it's important to understand just how vast and how large the state is. It's practically as if we were living in another country. The landmass is so enormous. So delivery of basic infrastructure to all of our villages and then the population center is challenging. Few demographic numbers. There are just under 700,000 people who live in Alaska. The majority live in what's called the rail belt, or the extension of the railway line. And you can see we are fond of saying, here is Alaska. And this main trunk section right there, as you can see mirrored on the map, runs from Homer to Anchorage to Fairbanks. And that's called the rail belt, and that's where the majority of people live. However, all of the outerlying villages, the tiny dots, which are actually representing diesel microgrids, we have another 70,000 people that live in these small outerlying parts, so providing service is challenging. And to the next slide, we'll look at where the Renewable Energy Fund, what it's accomplished. It's interesting to note that again, we have been successful in appropriating $260 million in appropriations from the state over the last 8 years. And this has ultimately, that much was appropriated, however only $128 million was actually spent on 54 projects. And it's these 54 projects, or the majority of them, that went to village microgrids. Some of our research indicates that it's the most per capita or per GDP spent in the United States on renewable energy. Next. I'm just zipping through some of the background so you understand the lay of the land economically, then I'll be explaining what's changed in the last 12 months. We have also an Emerging Energy Technologies Fund to test new technologies. There's a lot of interest in tidal and wave energy, though no projects currently landed. Okay, next. And then if you'll click next once more, a little pop-up appears, please. As a reference, 90% of Alaska's revenue comes from oil, or historically has, but as we all know, the cost of oil per barrel is so low, it's yielding a $4 billion annual budget deficit. Sadly, in gridlock, our legislature was unable to adopt tax measures and provisions that would have enabled us to dig out of this. Alaska, unusually, and it reflects the consciousness of a fairly young state, as well as really an ethos here about independence and anti-government. There is no sales tax, there is no income tax. In most of the state there is no residential building code. And so this reluctance to tax or regulate has also put Alaska in a position that's precarious financially. All three of the major credit rating agencies have downgraded Alaska's credit. And as you can imagine, if we head on to the next slide, I believe I reference at this point, what we're oft to say is that the party is over, and that's really impacted renewable energy funding. Catherine, if we can head to the next slide, maybe it's just loading. Yep, great. Okay, I think I've covered this point. We can keep going. But without this largesse of money funding projects, the question is now, well, how shall renewable energy development continue going forward? And REAP's standpoint really is that this, in fact, could be a good thing. We have two economists from Yale this summer who are doing extensive research and analysis on how else people are funding projects across the country, across the world, and how we can bring that to Alaska. So though it was initially a bit of a crisis for the state in terms of clean energy development, particularly in our microgrids, we thought, well, you know, really at the end of the day, grant-funded projects do not yield the opportunity to take advantage of the federal investment tax credit, which is at this time 30% of installed cost. So that's just one example of how maturing Alaska's clean energy development economy to a more business-like way of installing this energy infrastructure may be valuable. And indeed, what I'll say is that having the public's perception that renewable energy needs grant funding shoeboxes it to being experimental, not mainstream, not bankable, not attractive to investment. And really, as we're seeing, you know, the clean energy economy globally is valued at $300 billion. This is absolutely an investable opportunity, very mainstream, very proven, which is of course not going to be a surprise to anybody on the webinar, but helping to tell that story in a place that has so long been accustomed to oil revenue, to fossil fuel revenue. Clean energy is still something of a new story. Okay, next. Yep, just illustrating wind power resource. We have maps like this for each of our resources. Next again, a story I'm often telling to the public is that we do have a solar resource. We often speak about Germany and how we're at a similar line of latitude, at least parts of Alaska are, and yet we pale in comparison in terms of installed systems. In Anchorage, which has a population base of 350,000 people, we only have 2 solar companies, and they're really just small shops with several employees. There's just not that much consciousness and demand yet. So let's now start launching into microgrids, and I promise I will start defining this shortly. The map we were just looking at illustrates where microgrids are in Alaska, but now I'll just dwell for a second on what are microgrids. When I reference that term, it's one that's being thrown about quite a bit lately, and so in italics on the right, it's my right, you'll see the technical, the acknowledged definition of a discrete energy system consisting of distributed energy sources, not necessarily renewable. So I'm defining it today as a renewable microgrid that has at least one renewable element. It need not be entirely renewable. There may be a diesel backup, which is at this time only practical in the regions that we're working. It has demand management, storage, and generation. I would say storage at this time is also not necessarily a given in Alaska's microgrids, and loads capable of operating in parallel with or independently from the main power grid. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, this is often the example that is cited about why within a major networked electrical grid, likely the same kind of grid in which we each live, that there would be a need for a redundant backup system so that if your main grid goes down, you could have a microgrid in place. We're starting to see major consumers like MGM Grand in Las Vegas consider microgrids so that they have that redundancy of their own power supply independent of NV power, for instance. So just to draw the delineation, what we're talking about today would be a microgrid that has a rural, that is rural, it is not connected to a main interstate electricity transmission grid, and that has an element of a renewable energy in it. Please excuse yet further technical difficulty. I'm recognizing I need to pause and grab my power supply. One moment, please, lest you lose me as well.
We would never want to do that, so thanks for that consideration. We are also delighted that Stephan Schott was only experiencing in just a short time internet lag, so he's back on the session and will be happy to continue his presentation right after Piper's, so we're not missing out on anything. Apologies again for the hiccup, but I think you will understand that we are always facing the difficulty to have everybody on board in the single room at the single time. So thanks for your understanding, and I think we'll be back in a couple of seconds.
Okay, here we are. Sorry, but while we're talking about energy, it's only appropriate that the battery on the computer die. Okay, I think we can move on to the next PowerPoint, the next slide at this time. So here's a great, I've shamelessly ripped this off from ABB, which is a conglomerated company that provides a lot in terms of microgrid service. And I wanted to just illustrate, I think this is a really instructive infographic they've created. And it features Kodiak, which is an island in Alaska that is 99% renewable. And how were they able to do this? This is the ideal. This is what we're aiming for. It is definitely not the norm and definitely not happening yet. And it's also probably cost prohibitive in general. The way Kodiak has achieved their renewable energy goals and status is largely through hydropower and wind, as the center of the infographic illustrates. And they have a massive flywheel storage system. And the population is also fairly low at 15,000 people, but that is nonetheless very demonstrable. We're also talking about supplying power to villages that have 100 people, where the scale is dramatically lower, and indeed this question of scale will come up shortly. So anyway, I just thought this would be helpful to illustrate where we're headed. This is the ideal paradigm, even though Kodiak really is the only place in Alaska that is anywhere close. Okay, next. So just to reiterate, I wanted to explain a bit about the lay of the land and the conditions, why building a renewable microgrid is challenging. For starters, these are in villages, as mentioned, with really only a very small, relatively small number of inhabitants that are currently relying on diesel fuel that is delivered by a tanker, or in some cases must be flown in. So you can only imagine the high expense of creating a diesel run electricity system that's that vulnerable. And unsurprisingly, energy cost is 250% of the national average, where you're seeing 65 cents per kilowatt hour right up to over $1 a kilowatt hour, whereas what I'm paying in Anchorage is only 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and I would imagine that's about standard with what many of you are paying as well. European colleagues naturally a bit higher, but really on average nothing more than most of us are only paying about 1%, 1.5% was recently an article that came out. 1% of our entire budget, family budget, every year goes toward electricity. It is very cheap to be electrified in the majority of the world, but not in these rural, remote places. The climate is very harsh. You've got issues of wind turbine blades, icing, let alone getting a service call or a maintenance person out to the village to fix it. It would be a $500 one-way airline ticket on a small shuttle plane to get to many of our villages. And then, as we'll talk about shortly, the technical know-how of people who are living in a lot of Alaska's villages is just not there to even know how to know how to repair really what is fairly advanced energy generation infrastructure. And then finally, the logistics of erecting a wind turbine you may find interesting because of the sensitivity of permafrost and the scale of infrastructure that's necessary to erect a wind turbine. It is very expensive. So the process really is that by barge, a crane, and in some cases if there's any road connectivity, the majority of the villages have no road connectivity, so getting the infrastructure, the crane to erect the turbine out to the site is a 12-month process. And it's parked for the majority of that time. So the crane may be driven on permafrost only when it's frozen. But at that point, you can't also simultaneously drill into the permafrost to erect the footing properly and install the turbine. So we drive these cranes out on frozen ground, wait until it thaws enough to be drilling down for the foundation, then erect it, and then usually wait again until the fall to drive that crane back out. Cranes are such expensive infrastructure that a year-long rent to accomplish this, as historically has been done over the last 10 years, you can just imagine the project development, the capital costs are very high, and even when someone is paying 65 cents a kilowatt hour, it's hard to be profitable. And when we're doing this at such a small scale, it's even harder to be profitable. I wanted just to linger on a point that I skipped over now, and you'll see on reference the Power Cost Equalization Fund. Alaska is not dissimilar to many states in the country that have an energy subsidy for low-income people or people that are on the margin defined by the state. Alaska just happens to be spending a lot of money on it. Given our population base of only 700,000 people, we spend $50 million a year on subsidy. It's not ultimately improving the systems or adding more renewable energy to reduce diesel dependence. It's simply a straight, the worst kind of subsidy that goes to offset the cost of the first 500 kilowatt hours per month a residential consumer will pay. What REAP is advocating, and many organizations in the state, is that this be better leveraged or better deployed so that ultimately we reduce that dependence. We're nearing the end of my presentation, but I do have just a couple more slides. Yeah, and so the human factor. And I saw that Dr. Schott has had reference to balancing traditional practices, and this is very much a part of it. This is a photo of Leroy that my husband took. He's a documentary photographer and does a lot of work in Alaska's villages. And it's completely common for Alaska Natives to grow up with a subsistence lifestyle that may extend beyond your imagination about what that could look like, but where the organizing principle of a day has a lot to do with the natural rhythm of catching ground squirrels and then foraging for murre eggs and then shooting megafauna, and then perhaps in the spring the whale hunt if it's a village that has the right and access for whales. And there really isn't a lot of other economic activity other than this daily practice of subsistence, which is relevant to mention and start with, because when we are asking people in villages to be maintaining their own energy infrastructure, on the surface it doesn't seem like too large an ask. However, the parallel I like to draw is most everyone on this webinar has a cell phone contract, but it would never be dreamed that you would be asked to have the know-how, even if you lived in a remote place, to climb a cell phone tower, adjust something with that cell phone tower. You simply pay for the service of a cell phone. That's all you need to worry about. So I think there really is an opportunity as we're thinking about electrifying or providing thermal technology in Alaska's villages that we begin bringing that paradigm of the cell phone to it, because the past failures of microgrid technology to supply energy long-term or to be maintained may better reflect an unrealistic expectation and standard. What I'm alluding to there is that we have had some past failures. Grant-funded projects have had turbines, the story that is oft-told. Turbines were erected, they were either inaccurately engineered or improperly installed, and within 10 days collapsed and have been latent, just a pile of rubble for this village for the last 6 years. And that story, sadly, is not an isolated incident. So when we think about how we build capacity in villages, on one hand providing training and job opportunities for those who want it, but thinking about how that meshes in with a subsistence lifestyle where someone may need to leave and go hunt or fish and isn't going to be there to check on the diesel, isn't going to be there to check on the wind turbine optimization. How do we do this? And then what are other ways that we can reduce the energy demand in villages? A popular program has been these AMPI meters. It's a prepaid meter so that as energy is progressively used throughout a month, we can through behavioral methods ultimately dial down those energy costs. So anyway, I think we can move on toward one of my last slides. I hope just to provide some specificity here in really what it looks like to get clean energy accomplished in a rural, remote setting, which is common across the Arctic. Here's what we believe will work. There have been a number of studies recently through the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, as well as the Rural Assistance Program. As I mentioned, REAP has 2 economists this summer looking at the question as well. Here are some early things that we're learning about how we can do our rural microgrids better. Not all diesel systems are made equal. It's not heretical to be advocating renewable energy and also talk about more efficient diesel. It's the baseload power at this time. What we can do to increase the reliability and optimization of these systems, perhaps through performance contracts, which are not being used at this time. So then getting that leads us to better financial instruments and methods, whether that be leveraging the tax credit, as I first suggested. The U.S. federal tax code actually has a lot of incentive for capital investment in terms of accelerated depreciation, things that excite investors to put in a substantial amount of money. And then also how we actually govern these microgrids, as I alluded to, that there is a big question about how much we ask of local people, yet leading to the second to last bullet, workforce development is critical, and we don't want to deprive anyone willing to work on this technology a job. And finally, something I've just been kind of pondering myself is we're seeing great success nationwide in service-based renewable energy. So the consumer does not actually own the solar panel on their roof in the Solar City paradigm. Other companies are following suit. But rather, the consumer pays a flat monthly bill for the service of solar energy. And I'm wondering what that would look like if villages paid for the service of a microgrid. So with that, I think we're just about to the last slide. I hope I left some contact information there. Would welcome further dialogue with anyone or to clarify something I said. But thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Piper, for your presentation. I loved it. I already took down a number of questions, but I think I'll hold them back for now. Really interesting, especially the last slides with the developments as well. So I already saw there's already a question that has been posted earlier, but so feel free to start thinking about the questions and start typing them up. We will pick them up later. And but for now, I would like to hand over to Stephan. Thank you so much, Piper, and see you back in a second. And Stephan, if you can come up again. Let's see. There we go. Wonderful.
Hello.
Wonderful to have you back again.
My apologies.
No worries.
Turns out that internet is not as reliable in the south either.
All right. So no worries about it at all. And we're glad to have you back. And yes, I think we'll give you control again over your slides.
Sure.
And you can fast forward to the point where you were, or just start from scratch. I think that was just the first couple of minutes, and we'll be happy to pick them up again. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, as I said, I had an internet disruption here for 5 or 10 minutes, and so I all of a sudden was totally out of touch with the world. So I think I gave you this overview of the 6 main points, and I want to get right into them now. Thanks, Piper, for a very good background there on the Alaskan situation. There is some similarity in Canada as well, and I think you present some very interesting examples that illustrate some of the points that I'm making as well. So first, you showed already how high the energy costs are in Alaska. Similar situation in the north of Canada, where we are mostly dependent on costly diesel deliveries. But apart from the cost, we also deal with a lot of spillages, environmental problems, limited delivery periods, shipping only in certain weeks in the summer to communities. Air transport is limited. We also deal with local air pollution from diesel generation. Well, these are not to be underestimated. We often only look at the economic costs of the actual energy use. We have very large heating demands most of the year, which is different to what we are familiar with in the south. We have high transportation costs for air transport, but we also rely a lot on snowmobiles, ATVs, boats. There are no roads, limited number of roads in remote communities and anywhere in the Arctic. So you have people have to deal with 2 or 3 at least different types of transportation that are much more costly to run than energy efficient vehicles that we deal with, automobiles. We saw from Piper also the storage experiments or uses of flywheels, for example. There are limited storage options in the north because we often don't have hydropower dams or other uses of storing energy that we have traditionally in our larger grids in the south. And we also have limited experience with renewable technologies in extreme cold climate conditions. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. The housing conditions. Again, here we have very high cost of housing. Low energy efficiency, where there's lots that can be done in investments, in education and learning. We have very crowded dwellings where too many people are in very tight quarters, which causes social issues, which causes impediments to education and progress of the youth. And often it's mostly rental housing with the incentives it creates or disincentives for investment into energy efficiency, for example. Oh, I'm going to go up. Reliability and availability of energy sources. We have diesel supply mostly and prices, which are very high. But there are other energy sources that are being considered but haven't really been integrated into the energy system yet. And those are, for example, biomass for heating, for example, in Nunatsiavut, which is an Inuit region of Labrador, and for energy provision in boilers in the Northwest Territories that is experimenting with that. But mostly the biomass is imported and not locally sourced yet. We have large hydro in certain areas, like in the south of the Northwest Territories or in the Yukon. But there we have actually already experienced some implications from climate change, where 3 years ago Northwest Territories experienced a major drought and couldn't generate the hydropower that they were anticipating, and then they had to buy extra diesel and use extra diesel generation to make up for that shortfall. There are natural gas supplies, for example, in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, but again there the supplies were lower than anticipated, causing some problems because the infrastructure was changed, and now they are running out of natural gas, and therefore are considering other options such as liquefied natural gas. In Canada, we're currently debating potential supply of certain Arctic areas with liquefied natural gas and the infrastructure it would require, or to look at renewable options as an alternative to some diesel production or diesel hybrid systems. I mentioned earlier food security is a major issue in the north, and again, energy or Transfer costs are related to that in two ways. Air transfer costs for store-bought food drives up prices, and so does limited competition of stores in these areas. I recently went to northern Quebec, Kukujuak, where we have 3 competing stores, and you see considerably lower prices of food in the store than in most of the Arctic areas where you only have 1 store or 2 stores competing. Also, we are facing increasing costs for subsistence harvesting. Subsistence harvesting is a major source of nutritious, culturally desirable food, but again, increasingly many residents of the Arctic find it difficult to afford going out to hunt and harvest on the land due to high fuel, investment and maintenance costs that impede this access to country food. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next. Again, economic diversification, volatility. And Piper mentioned that there's often not a lot of economic potential or economic sectors that can be chosen for employment or revenue generation. It's true that in the Canadian North, the regions mostly depend on public administration, which is really government expenditures and employment, or mining for GDP generation. The alternative energy or renewable energy sector might provide some opportunities to create new economic sectors and to test also technologies in extreme climate conditions that then can be also perhaps exported or transferred to other areas. Commodity prices fluctuate heavily and currently are in a slump. So mining is actually a problem right now. There are not a lot of revenues generated. Mines are closing, new mines are not popping up as much. So the Arctic region can feel this dependency on a sector that is a boom and bust cycle, and right now we are in a slump. There is a lack of skills and manufacturing base that can be relied on, and energy costs are an issue for mining companies and new businesses. So directly, if we provide alternative energy solutions through other sources or microgrids, it would also spur new economic development. This is true for mining companies, but also, for example, for fishery processing. That there are lots of commercial fisheries are actually a growing sector in Nunavut, for example, but often face also issues with cooling and processing and the energy costs that are related to that. I'll go to the next slide. And finally, balancing of traditional practices and economic development. New economic branches really have to consider traditional practices and cultural needs. Ideally, they combine land-based activities with wage-based activities. For example, in the biomass collection from the land, we had some pilot projects in the Northwest Territories. While people go out on the land, they can also collect or gather biomass that they can use for energy production. Or while people go out on the land to fish, they can also engage in a commercial fishery and sell part of the catch commercially, either to other residents that can't afford or don't have the time to go out on the land, or to trade within their region or outside of their region. Also, it's very important to minimize interference with traditional hunting and fishing practices as much as possible. We have seen that with wind power installation, although the atlas might show us extremely good wind power potential, it was just impeding with traditional practices or the perception that it might interfere with caribou migrations, etc. The same is true for railway or shipping routes for mining operation. A good example is the recent large iron ore mine in Mary River, Baffinland, here in Nunavut, which is a very high concentration iron ore mine. And the major issue is the shipping routes. Now that iron ore prices are low and in the low, the company, in order to survive, needs to scale up production, therefore wants to ship all year round, which causes some controversies how shipping might interfere with ice routes for hunting and fishing, etc. So having provided this overview of the main challenges and how they might be related to energy, we recently, my colleague Alexandra Mallet, who's also working in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University, and 3 students, David Cherniak, Vincent Dufresne, and Lawrence Keat. Lawrence Keat is now with Polar Knowledge Canada. We were commissioned by our High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay and Polar Knowledge Canada later on, which was established in January 2015, to look at, to provide a report on what do we know about alternative energy in the Canadian Arctic, in all our northern regions, in the territories as well as in the Inuit self-administered region of Nunavik and Nunatsiavut. Nunavik is part of Quebec and Nunatsiavut part of Labrador and Newfoundland. So we wanted to give an overlay of the land of what do we know about alternative energy in the Arctic. We provided a very detailed report, over 200 pages, that we published on our website at Carleton University. There's the address. You can download that PDF file, and if you have any questions, please contact us. We work closely with our northern partners, utilities, NGOs, other people that are working in the energy sector to provide us with information. We held a workshop in Yellowknife in 2014, and in this report we looked at really what are the current projects, what are emerging new projects, what are policies that guide this process, what are impediments, barriers to progress, how do we conduct financial analysis that tells us how to invest into alternative energy, and what the rules and objectives are. So first, to give you an overview, we looked at the total number of renewable energy projects by regions, and as you can see here, the older territories, Yukon and Northwest Territories, are way ahead of Nunavut and the other regions in terms of renewable energy projects, both for heating and electricity. And if you look at the types, mostly it's solar, PV. Wind is not as abundant as you might anticipate, but as Piper mentioned, there has been some bad experiences with the first generation wind turbines that were quickly installed and soon did not operate satisfactorily anymore, or were dismantled or collapsed, or people didn't know how to maintain them. So that was kind of a bad experience that for a while discouraged new investment into those types of technologies. Hydro is quite abundant in Yukon and Northwest Territories. There are also new energy projects are planned there. Solar and wind, biomass in Northwest Territories is now becoming a larger area of renewables. And so also what we've done in that report, we tried to see what general policy insights, lessons learned were from the report. We also conducted 8 case studies where we could go into more detail on certain projects and how they emerged, what the barriers were, what direct insights we learned from them. And we, at the end also, and I will not talk about that today, made research recommendation for future research in this area, because that was our initial objective of giving an overview and what we learned from it, and also to guide the Canadian government and Polar Knowledge Canada in their research funding in the future. So some lessons learned from this project is that it's quite difficult for independent alternative energy projects to enter the market we saw in many areas that power purchase agreements need to be recrafted. Nunavik, for example, is an example. We did a case study on a run-of-the-river hydropower project that failed because they couldn't agree on a reasonable price for the project. There is a very powerful utility, Hydro-Quebec, that basically only wanted to pay for the displaced cost of diesel and no other advantages that this project could supply, such as reduced capacity, more flexibility in the system, new economic opportunities, and so on. We also found that arm's-length energy NGOs, such as the Arctic Energy Alliance, are very crucial to success. The Arctic Energy Alliance in Northwest Territories has 6 different regional offices and is really supporting alternative energy projects, microgrids, education, and getting people thinking about alternative energy. Reinvest into new generation renewables, we found, is an important step, and also to share data with mining companies such as Raglan in Quebec and Diavik in Northwest Territories. The Raglan mine, operated by Glencore, and Diavik recently invested on their own into wind turbines that are used to displace large amounts of diesel fuel, and they are operating much more successfully than in the past. And it's important, I think, for communities to get hold of that data and see how they could, what to expect if they invested in new renewables or 2nd or 3rd generation renewable technologies. As I mentioned in the example of Nunavik, new economic opportunities with excess hydro, solar, or wind in specific seasons are very promising. And also the knowledge gained from renewable technologies in extreme cold climate conditions, that expertise and service can also be used in other areas of the North American Arctic or circumpolar world, and can also be an employment and economic activity that is not to be underestimated. Okay, I'll go to the next slide here. Energy autonomy also is quite important, even if it's not the optimal short-term financial option. We saw that in Northwest Territory in the case of a solar project in Lutzelki, and also in biomass production or biomass boilers in Fort McPherson, that it is communities actually have a pride in owning and operating their own renewable energy and getting away from some diesel generation. That can have benefit in itself in educating the community, in getting buy-in and motivation in these investments and sharing experiences. Locally sourced biomass is an interesting option in certain areas for district heating and electricity generation rather than importing wood pellets. And also we found, since we are in a federal system in Canada, that a unified approach to policies is very important. It's important to have high-level political commitments that are then integrated or combined with a coordinated overarching policy approach with regionally appropriate renewable energy conservation and energy efficiency strategies that are all incorporated into overall energy plans. It's very important to coordinate that, but to also have a vision and a specific plan. An example of a long-term vision to guide short and medium-term planning is the Yukon 20-year plan, which also provides systematic and detailed financial analysis that includes sensitivity analysis, numerous scenarios, and information about technologies of interest. We found that very important in terms of actually reaching targets, milestones, and objectives. The further development of specific energy efficiency endorsement labels for the North, such as the Super Green Home Performance Label or Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design LEED, created by Northerners for Northerners, are extremely important to make headway in energy efficiency in buildings and involve Northerners, but also to consider the Northern context and not to blindly apply what might work for Southern communities or housing. We also found quite a disparity in how the saved costs are assessed, we think a more comprehensive calculation of all the saved costs, including greenhouse gas emission reductions, air quality impacts, spillage externalities tied to diesel displacement needs to be derived for different local contexts. We find that that wasn't consistent and transparent in deciding if certain projects were adopted or not. And I'm almost at the end here, 2 more slides. I believe demand side management and conservation versus capacity adjustment is a very interesting topic where we have an increasingly uncertain and volatile environment where utilities don't know what will happen to future demands and therefore they don't know how much capacity to invest. So increasingly we need system flexibility where we need mobile units or work with conservation and demand side management to give us some room to move and not to overinvest into capacity or to underinvest into capacity, because some communities are growing fast, others are declining in numbers because certain economic sectors are declining. So that's something that really needs to be further addressed. Piper talked also already about capacity building and education. Many communities do not have the skills or capacity to monitor, operate some of these technologies, and we really need to invest in capacity and education. We have to actively engage local users and generators in the energy policy process, examine potential for alternative financing models to support renewable energy and energy efficiency and conservation. I guess that's the same issue in Alaska now, that the petroleum fund or the resources are dwindling and therefore you don't have access public support for financing, but there are private investors that might be interested in investing as long as utilities give better conditions for private power purchase agreements. We also need more pilot projects and data assessment in these conditions. Again, an opportunity for training and new employment. And we also found that it's important to have a network of project champions to promote the sharing of knowledge and experience between communities across the Arctic and to support areas with no champions or lack of expertise. As we said, we had the Arctic Energy Alliance, for example, Northwest Territories, and some other areas really don't have this kind of NGO involvement and just developing expertise and project champions. So it's we'd like to see more of a consistent network and interaction between these regions and communities in order to learn from each other and to advance technologies and implementations of projects. And that's the end of the slideshow. Feel free to ask questions. The email will be made available, as I believe, and to contact me personally about any of the contents that I was talking about or any questions you have. Thanks so much.